All right, it won now, so I think we'll start.
Okay.
Okay. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled International Development in the COVID-19 Era. What is our added value? My name is Laura Wilson, and I'm the project officer for the University of Waterloo's largest international development project, READY, which is funded by Global Affairs Canada. And I'll be moderating today's discussion. This webinar is co-sponsored by the University of Waterloo and the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals. CAIDP is a nonprofit association that represents Canadian international development professionals in Canada and elsewhere in the world. During this webinar, an expert panel drawn from our Canadian international development community and policy experts from the University of Waterloo and the Basili School of International Affairs will provide insights on what impact COVID has had on international development and what we in the international development community can offer as we look to the future. In advance of the webinar, we have asked our speakers and CAIDP members for their thoughts on key issues and changes. The panel will start with those, and we hope that you will contribute to the discussion by typing in your questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We will try to include as many as your questions into the Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. The webinar will be recorded and available on the CAIDP website shortly after. One of our speakers will have to leave at 1:55 p.m. and so we'll end the webinar at that time. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have included bios for all of our speakers in the webinar invitations, so I will only briefly introduce our panelists to save time for the panel discussion. We are delighted and honored to have with us two outstanding policy experts. Dr. Besma Momani is the University of Waterloo Assistant Vice President, International Relations, and Professor in Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And Dr. Rohitan Medhora is the President of the Center for International Governance Innovation. Along with them, we will have two very experienced international development practitioners, Bill Duggan, who is the University of Waterloo READY Project Director, and Jean Lowry, CAIDP President and University of Waterloo READY Project Director. So now we'll begin the discussion. My first question will go to Jean. What did the development landscape look like prior to COVID-19? What were the key elements and expectations?
Thank you so much, Laura, and welcome on behalf of CAIDP and the university to all of the participants. As a starting point, we thought it might be useful to provide a bit of a picture of what international development looked like a little over like 9 months ago. It's unbelievable. It's been such a short time, but it's just been a very, very short time since COVID hit. So I'm going to focus just on a few highlights of the past 5 years and primarily on just the recent years prior to COVID. So prior to COVID, Canada's target of spending 0.7% of its GNI on official development assistance by 2030 was not on track. The Feminist International Development Assistance Policy, FIAP, was announced in 2017 and was heralded as being an extremely important new development in focusing on feminist approaches to development. That was not, however, accompanied by a significant increase in the amount of funding that was made available for official development assistance. What did happen, though, in 2018 was that a new budget was put out that announced two new programs, new to Canada, though not new to the world, in the form of an International Assistance Innovation Program and the Sovereign Loans Programs, totaling $1.5 billion. Most of that, however, was coming out of what seems to be already existing resources, so there's not a lot of new money. What is significant, though, is that this move towards blended finance seems to work really well in some areas. And so there is a definite push towards saying that what we need to do is to combine the government official development assistance with private sector efforts to see whether or not you can leverage one with the others. The early evidence seems to be that this kind of blended finance program works well with infrastructure projects where there's almost a guaranteed return on investment. But it's a little bit more difficult to make happen when you're talking about a health sector, an education sector, or something that has much less tangible returns on investments. Prior to COVID, and I speak as the president of CAIDP, all of the association and international development groups work pretty much independently. We had very, very cordial relations, of course, between us. And there was the odd effort that was put in place to talk about doing some joint efforts and joint position papers and things of that nature. But for most part, we were pretty much siloed, I'll call it that. GAC approved projects in the $20 million range. There was quite a few of them that came out in 2015 to 2018, which involved extensive hands-on delivery in the country, local teams generally led by Canadians or with Canadian specialists fanning out to deliver technical assistance and capacity building. All of it involved extensive travel, as I well know. Contracting processes were time-consuming and very detailed. But solution teams were being put in place prior to COVID to actually simplify some of those things. So in a nutshell, I do want to point out that even prior to COVID, there were very few RFPs that were coming out from Global Affairs Canada. And so the majority of our CAIDP members, based on a survey we undertook in 2018, were obtaining the bulk of their funding from non-GAC sources. So that in a nutshell is where we were as of kind of March 2020, when my and many other people's travels were interrupted by the recall, and we all ended back mostly in quarantine or trying to figure out what life will look like from here on in. So with that, I'll turn back over to Laura for the next question.
Thank you so much, Jean. I'll look to Rohitan for this next question. As we get past the immediate response to COVID-19 pandemic, what has changed in terms of international development, both on the ground and in terms of international development institutions themselves? What seems to be working, and where do you see major issues developing? Are these changes permanent or temporary?
Right. Well, first, I'd like to thank CAIDP and the University of Waterloo for organizing our discussion and for having me. I answer that very important set of questions with a trick multiple choice. And of course, in this group, I suspect it's not a trick, you know the answer, but it goes something like this. Which country do you think has the lowest infection rate and mortality rate on account of COVID between India, Pakistan, and Iran? And I'm guessing most people would not say Pakistan, but the fact is, it is by multiples. 1/17 of the Iranian statistics, 1/35 of the Indian statistics. So my point is that there's so much we don't know. And one of the things we don't know actually is exactly what is the nature of this pandemic. In fact, the editor of The Lancet has a piece today in which he calls it a syndemic, not a pandemic. And that's because this isn't just a medical and biological phenomenon, but it's closely connected to underlying rates in non-communicable diseases and in socioeconomic status. You mix all of that up, and for development professionals, none of this is news, right? We've always known that development is a complex process, that everything is connected to everything. And so a very simple answer to your complex question would be not much has changed. If I think of the kinds of issues we were exercised by before January, they're all there, perhaps there's been some octane added to them, but let me just give you 2 or 3 examples of what's changed and what might not, and where do we go from here. I'd say I'd begin by saying, in governance terms, one of the promising developments was that the G20 was created to actually bring in, if not development, at least emerging country and emerging power voices. And the G20 has been anemic in its response in almost every way. Debt relief has been minimal and piecemeal, with the exception of COVAX, which I think is a big exception and a very promising concept. Cooperation has been lacking, and as we've seen in things like trade, there has been much more ad hoc protection and nationalism. And so these are all things that work against development. And remember, this is all happening at a time when ODA budgets were declining everywhere. Jean mentioned the Canadian case, but think of UK, think of the European Union. There are not very many bright spots here. Most developing countries, thanks to the statistics in India and China, had kind of achieved their MDGs and were more or less on their way to doing something about the SDGs. And we now find ourselves in a situation where we have regressed, and the achievements of the last 10 years might be in jeopardy because we don't have macroeconomic responses that are commensurate to what's going on, and we don't have systems that were strong enough. So I do think the development discourse has to go back to basics, has to make the link between economics and society. And the final point I'd make, having talked about COVAX, is if there's one good thing that comes out of this, and if it is cooperation in the area of scientific research, reform in the way we do intellectual property, which then spills into green technologies and climate change issues, and a sense that the vaccine, once it's available, is distributed in a way that we have global herd immunity, then I think something good would have come out of it. But the signs right now are of a community in turmoil, in recession, at a time when we need cooperation and when we need a bit more organization.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Our next question will go to Besma. The question is, what are the opportunities that now exist in this new landscape for Canadians and Canadian institutions, such as universities, research institutions, the private sector, or NGOs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a good follow-up from the context that Rohinton gave us, because, you know, we are all trying to do more with less. I mean, it's just the reality of where we are, and pooling resources is important, especially at a time when, frankly, we're trying to get all the greatest minds in the scientific community together to find a cure, or at least a vaccine, I should say, to this, because collectively we're all suffering. So absolutely, I think there is a case to be made for enhanced cooperation. The challenge is the context, and we saw this from, you know, I mean, one looks at what happened with the personal protection equipment, the PPE, you know, the scramble for everybody to just hoard to themselves. And I want to point out, it's not just at a global scale, and we certainly saw that with, for example, the Trump administration's reactions to the 3M company and providing goods to Canada, but even we saw that competitive space at the very local level, right? So we saw, for example, you know, mayors against mayors fighting for companies to provide them with equipment. I mean, it's that kind of very introverted nature, unfortunately. And there's fantastic examples of cooperation, without a doubt. Let's not suggest that, you know, it's all a state of nature type world, but it is unfortunately brought to the fore. How those interconnectedness can also be our weakness, in the sense that we saw this in production chains, for example, the difficulty of being able to just keep the process of manufacturing going. But then also, unfortunately, human behavior kicked in, and we saw that kind of introverted nature. And yet the problem is so big, in the sense that obviously on the discovery side of a vaccine, clearly we need to pool resources if we're going to get this, because we all benefit if we do. There's no value in having one country, one city from having a vaccine and the others not. It simply just doesn't work that way, because we know the reason why this virus was able to travel was because of our interconnected nature. It simply doesn't stop at a border. That's just simple. But how do we do that? So how do we pool resources? How do we effectively cooperate? It's by understanding that, I think, if we're going to, when it comes to ODA, when it comes to international development writ large, is to think about all the partners that can be brought in. And I have to make the case for universities because in many ways they're often forgotten in this mix. And yet you have some of the great researchers who are motivated by, not motivated with the same, let's be frank, the same incentives as industry would. They're very much motivated by the pursuit of the knowledge itself in many cases. And so that can be harnessed for that goodwill when we're looking for champions of that common goodwill, the public will. Universities can be a fantastic place to do that. I would say similar to civil society organization, NGOs. I mean, so much of the membership of this group really is from the NGO sector. And we know they're do-gooders. I mean, in many ways, they have options to work in the private sector for a much higher wage, but would want to work in the NGO and CSO community, and let's harness that. So I mean, I think there's an opportunity to find that coalition of the willing, sorry, use an awful George Bush terminology of Iraq war, but you need to find those. You need to find those people who want to work in the common interest. And I think, lastly, because the fiscal space is shrinking, we can't ignore that. I mean, I'm mindful that I'm constantly telling my colleagues, many who are in academia, who tend to be very much in the let's spend more money on this, containing not just the virus, but in the stimulus getting out of this. But there are many, I think, voices, public voices, who are very fearful of the debt. I mean, it's an uncomfortable conversation to have because it seems like we're surrounded by folks who tend to lean to that way, who just want to spend more money at this. But there are a lot of concerns about the debt. And so we're going to have to start thinking about, okay, the fiscal space is shrinking. So let's get all of the, the interested parties, the goodwillers, if you will, or those who want to contribute to the goodwill, to collectively think about ways of getting out of this. And so we're going to see government lean on parties like the public, like universities, like NGOs and CSOs. I mean, I hope industry comes into this. I mean, clearly, there's still a lot of the cash account balances of a lot of the large corporations throughout the world are still healthy. Getting them to spend, getting to think about their collective, will is really important. So it's a classic coordination problem, but hopefully I think when you start thinking about ways of bridging that and bringing in conveners, and sometimes it requires government to do that because they have the connections to make that. I'm hoping that we can start to see that we can kind of make progress in some of these development issues around the globe.
A lot of great points, Presma. Thank you so much. Bill, I'd like to ask you, COVID-19 has increased our dependency on digital infrastructure and connectivity. However, almost 59% of the population remain unconnected to digital services and risk being left behind. How can this be addressed?
Hi, thanks very much, Laura, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, maybe I'll just start, Laura. I think it's 59% of the world has access to the internet now. So there's about 41% that don't, but that's still an awful lot of people. Yes, I mean, we've all seen that. We've even seen that here in Canada, that very quickly, everything, business, education, commerce, there's been a huge push to go online. Happily, the networks here have done fairly well. But I'm sure it's not that way all around the world, and there's many parts of the world that don't have the infrastructure that we have, of course, and many of them don't have much, even electricity. I'd like to look at 7 or 8 different factors, I think, that have impact on this. Education, to start with, there's always been great inequities all over the world, but even here in Canada. I used to work for the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs, right here in the province of Ontario, just a flight up to Thunder Bay and then a little further north. And the quality of education there was vastly different from what you could get in Southern Ontario. I remember we used to run school bingos to raise money to buy photocopying paper and other things. So we still have issues here in Canada. Sometimes we forget that. But certainly it's of course worse in many parts of the developing world. And the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated some of those challenges. If we look at platforms for virtual or learning by distance, there's the internet, which we all think of. But there's also TV, and almost all countries around the world use TV. Here in Ontario, of course, we have TV Ontario. It's used less and less, I think, now because of the internet. But many other countries, like in India, it's huge. And most countries in the world are using TV-based education as one strategy for dealing with the pandemic. There's also radio. I think a lot of us are familiar with various radio programs. Farm Radio Network is one from Canada here that's run for decades and decades, continues to do good work. But radio is used all over the world as well. And even a lot of countries are using SMS. You know, it must be quite limited in the dimensionality, but a lot of countries are using SMSs or social media, running online education via WhatsApp and things like that. But there's a few issues. As we all know, internet coverage is uneven around the world, and there's affordability issues. So not everyone has a good signal or can afford to have a device that'll allow them to access it. And then you have to be able to afford to, as I said, to buy a laptop or a smartphone or even have a radio, and that's not the case everywhere. For TV, again, there's access to good signals, and there's the ability to pay for the service or to have electricity. When we talk about education, we've seen here in Canada, let alone everywhere else in the world, most teachers were not used to doing online teaching. Okay, so there's a huge push to get people that we've seen here in Ontario. I've got one son, a teenage son, he's still not on online learning. He's been waiting for 2 weeks, he's still on a waiting list, okay, because they're still not fully up to speed. So there have to be quick retraining of teachers. As we know from University of Waterloo, developing online content, it takes a lot of work and quite a lot of time. Once you have it, it's great, but the initial investment is quite significant. And then there's parental involvement. Laura, you know this, you've got young kids. If you've got kids at home who are suddenly doing their learning from on home, guess what? They need support, okay? And sometimes it's not support. Sometimes it's, you know, you've got classes. Sometimes I've got teenagers. Sometimes it's saying, come on, what are you supposed to be doing, guys? So that means you've got to be providing support. And in many cases, especially for people that have young kids, maybe that means one of the partners can't take on their full-time job or can't work as much. So that has an impact. And then there are families all over the world. Some can afford to form their own bubbles, to hire teachers, so they can buy the access that they need. So it's very uneven around the world. So those are all the issues. There's a number of solutions. I don't know if you want me to speak to some of the potential solutions now or not, but just to say that obviously all these challenges are more dramatic, are amplified in developing countries.
Thanks, Bill.
Bill, just a question. Is it more pronounced among women and girls, or is there a gender aspect to that?
Well, it's an interesting question, Jean. I think women and girls all over the world, but as we know, whenever a machine is involved or technology, often men suddenly, you know, who controls the remote for the TV, right? It's the running joke. So yes, often girls are going to have a harder time getting hold of some of those technologies if it's the one family laptop or the one family smartphone. Or like for instance, in India, 120 million Indian farmers have smartphones, but chances are they're carrying that with them about their daily work. So the kids and maybe the daughters aren't having access to them. So it's more pronounced for girls, but it's for boys and girls.
And Laura, if I may, Besma, how does that pick up on then what you were saying about opportunities? So is there an opportunity for Canadian private sector, universities, academia to start addressing some of those?
I really do believe that there is, but again, it's, you know, really incumbent on government, I think, to play the convening role here, because, you know, I mean, not to say that, for example, universities, we certainly have strong connections directly into industry, and certainly with CSOs and NGOs, but I think it really is incumbent on government because they can leverage, they can put obviously the incentives in place, they can certainly have that convening power to bring the right people in the room. And so, I mean, it requires leadership in many cases. There's no shortage, I think, once one looks for a multitude of actors to contribute to, again, that public will, but when one needs to find a convener, and I think it's incumbent on government to have that leadership role to bring the right people around, and also to put some incentives and leverage what existing funding they want, so leveraging some of that funding to get others to also be motivated to contribute as well. So a lot can be done, but, you know, it requires will.
Thank you. Back
Thank
over to
you.
Laura.
Moving on, back to Rohit, I have a question here. How has the Canadian government's attitude and approach towards international development changed as a result of COVID? Recently, the throne speech made reference to continued involvement in international development, but what could or should that look like? And how might models of economic development change post COVID-19? Will we see reduced political support for foreign aid?
So on your first and last point, political support for ODA and Canadian government, I'd say we were for some time in a stage where we had well-meaning words and intentions that were not backed up by resources. And I'm not one of those who thinks money solves all problems, but as Jean pointed out and as Besma mentioned, the disconnect between what the needs are and what was on offer is quite stark. The disinterest in development, by the way, is a long-term story in Canada. It's not something that is recent and cannot and should not be pinned on any particular party or government. Those of us in the development world know that it's one thing to have people say they care about the rest of the world, and it's quite another to convince them to do something about it and support government policies that do something about it. I already mentioned the G20, in which Canada is a 1/19. There are 19 members by the G20 shareholder. I come back to COVAX, which, by the way, the concept was initiated by our Prime Minister when he did an op-ed with several other leaders in the Washington Post about 3 or 4 months ago. That was the impetus we needed to start thinking about vaccine, not just as a medical issue, but as a socioeconomic issue and as a policy tool. And so I think we should be proud that Canada has signed on to COVAX, that it had an early role in sensitizing people globally to that subject. The US, China, and Russia have not signed on to COVAX, so I'm not sure where this is all headed. I also don't doubt that if there is a vaccine and there's not enough of it, global good intentions would go out the window and governments would perhaps correctly be looking out for their own citizens first. But I do think that would be short-sighted, because it's not enough to fight this within your borders, as we know with any such issue. If there are pockets that remain, as we saw with polio and smallpox a generation ago, then they keep coming back to haunt you. So I think there's self-interest in seeing vaccination as a global public good. I have not seen, although I'm not on the inside the way so many of you are, I have not seen very much discussion on how ODA might change other than the COVAX point. I know that I have colleagues in your world who tell me that the initiative to have X%, say 2% of Canada's stimulus for COVID be devoted to development issues has not had much traction, mainly because, as a couple of you pointed out, the macroeconomics of dimensions and the debt and deficit implications are so high that to say, not only should we be busting these ceilings, but let's also do it by saving the world, does not have much traction in many parts of Holland. So an ongoing trend of disinterest in ODA is likely to continue. Within the smaller budget, if there are things that we can reorient, that would be a good thing. But I really think that the action is not ODA so much as policy coordination and better governance.
Thank you.
Laura, can I add a point there?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Rohit, interesting points. You know, one of the things we've all seen in the pandemic is that certain businesses are doing extremely well, and they're the ones that are online. You know, Amazon, examples. Anything that's online is just doing very Zoom, but many technologies. So it seems like the private sector, sure, of course, for many portions of the private sector are really, really suffering, but there are others that are doing extremely well, and the polarization of wealth is incredible. It would sure be nice if development actors could work more and more with people like Amazon and Zoom and others to try and, again, generate some of the momentum we need.
If I could as well, just to pick up on that, the original part of the original question was with regard to GAC and the Government of Canada's attitude and approach. And I think that's from my little mini history lesson that I provided at the beginning. What I'm seeing now, and again, wearing my CAIDP hat, is that the sector has changed massively. I mean, instead of now working in silos, we as associations across the international development sector, whether it's CSO, CCIC, CanWatch, the Climate Change Network, all of the ICN, we're all working very, very closely together. And a lot of that is now being pulled together at the request of the GAC. Initially, we requested meetings with the minister, and the minister was gracious enough to actually provide us with opportunities for town hall meetings that had 500-600 people at them. It was just massive. So this has been an extraordinary change, I think, that we really need to make a reference to, because it has changed the scope of what we're doing. There was a lot of adaptation and flexibility on the part of Global Affairs Canada in terms of addressing contract issues and things of that nature. So what will be really interesting to see is how it translates as we move forward. Back over. Unless anybody else had a comment.
Since you mentioned CCIC, I believe it's September 30th, and I know BESMA's a part of that. We are having a discussion with CCIC on the web, with CG, on what a development-friendly COVID recovery might look like. And we're going to have Goldie Hyder from the Business Council and Jennifer Welch from McGill join us. And I think this is something we, in our various capacities and wearing various hats, have to keep at. And I do take Jean's point that coordination is of the essence.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Over to BESMA. The argument has been made that we should not be spending money on international development, given the enormous amount of money spent already in Canada on COVID. What is the policy case for continued international development post-COVID-19?
I mean, I think, look, it's always going to be that classic dilemma. I mean, and Bill kind of pointed to some of the challenges we face in Canada. I mean, I remember being in the room with a chief elder who said, why are we talking about developing world when we have communities in our own backyard who have, some of the worst human socioeconomic and human indicators? Why focus on all this effort to save the world when we can't do anything about these communities locally? So, this is a classic question. I did my master's in development studies, and I think we've been toying with that. That was 30 years ago. We've been talking about this for such a long time. I mean, Bill also talked about, I believe it was Bill, in the rural communities in this country. So many rural communities in this country don't have access to secure broadband, and as we're all shifting to work from home, they're going to be at a disadvantage. So there's so many layers of this one can go on. It's an endless challenge. At the end of the day, I think we go back to the principles of the global public good. It really is just that simple, right? I mean, the virus was a great example of what happens when you just assume that somehow things stop at borders. It doesn't work that way. And so it requires that kind of global effort. And I do still think there's responsibility. I know I recently got in a bit of hot water with the media with the Lebanon crisis because, Canada put forward $5 million initially, and I said, well, that's a joke. And it garnered a lot of people, the general public, who thought that was really offensive. Why are you discounting $5 million? And I respect that it seems like it's a lot to one person, but we have to keep in mind, as I said in my response, was the average price home in Toronto is $1 million. Again, it's not accessible to most people, but this great G7 country that we're so proud of, can't muster together $5 million, 5 houses for there's just got to be a concept of scale and responsibility, at the end of the day. And some of that is, increasingly we are a country that is it is the reality of being a multicultural country, so many people coming from other parts of the world. That indifference to other people from other countries, that comes back. People feel it in the multicultural communities, that somehow we don't care about the world for other reasons. So I think it's an old debate about why global public goods, but time and time again, I think we're stronger for it. It's cliche, but it's true. And then in the end, we strengthen our society as an increasingly diverse one. And I think we have a moral responsibility. We are a G7 country. We can't. My critique of Canadian foreign policy of recent days has been, it's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of grandstanding, huge normative challenges, and then we say, here is $12 million, go solve gender inequity in the globe. It doesn't work that way. Ideas alone and goodwill alone is not enough. You need to put money behind it. But you can also leverage. There's opportunity there for government to leverage and use its convening power to get people around the room. As Bill said, there are corporations that are doing really, really well. Let's get that spirit of that public good infused. CSR, corporate social responsibility, is an old principle, but we need to use it purposely. And I think sometimes we have to appeal to that soft side of getting companies and CEOs and others inside these corporations to see the value for their own brand, because they are not going to be seen in positive light in the eyes of the consumer, which is still an important part of their constituents, if they don't give back. So I think there's lots to be done, but again, it takes convening power, it takes leadership, and that's what really I think many people are looking for from Ottawa.
Laura, can I add another point?
Yep.
Yeah, I agree with Cosma completely. There's the moral imperative of it's the right thing to do, or we could say the do-gooder. We are so lucky here in Canada. We've all traveled a lot, and we see all the wonderful things we have to be thankful for. So certainly the moral imperative, but there's also the self-serving, much more self-centered one that works for other people, and that is that we see in Europe, where there's been so much forced migration, people fleeing due to climate change, people flying wars, people flying due to irresponsible governance. And it's a huge problem in Europe. We see that. Now, we're protected by a couple of oceans, so these things don't tend to impact us as directly. But if we just look at climate change, okay, if we don't get it right in Canada and in the rest of the world, it's going to come back and really bite us on many different accounts. So there's both arguments. It's the right thing to do, but it's also the pragmatic thing to do. Because otherwise, a lot of these problems, whether it's security or climate change or diseases, as we've seen with diseases, we're an interconnected world now.
Just I'll add a pick up on that without getting into the definitions of pandemics. Bill and I have different agreements on this one. He knows where I'm going with this, but I think what we're seeing, and one of the real effects of climate change is a change in vectors, where you have, for example, in the Caribbean, mosquitoes that didn't exist before, like the Aegyptus adelis, which carries Zika and malaria and stuff. Those mosquitoes are now in the Caribbean where they used to not be. You're getting plant pests that are now in areas that never existed before. And so what you're going to end up with is a smaller world that where you're facing issues, food security issues because of crop failures, health issues because of the introduction of diseases that were never there before. And all of this is going to be intertwined and become a part of what we're dealing with increasingly. So yeah, I think, Besma, you kind of nailed it. It's a really small world. Okay.
I have one final question before we go into the audience's questions. This one will be for Bill and Jean. International development has always involved a need for extensive travel. In the next 6 months to a year, what would you expect to see? When would it be right to put Canadians back in the field? How can young professionals gain international development experience in the future?
You got to turn your mic on. Go ahead.
Jean, you can start.
Yeah, so Okay, sure. Okay, so I think in the next, where part of this, the discussion started when we convened a panel on the ethics of sending people back into the field. So, there was one argument that was sort of jokingly being made about, send only the young people because their mortality rates are lower. And then some of the young people were suggesting you send the older folks. It was kind of a sick joke, but what can I say? In any event, the bottom line in all of this is that we all are waiting for a vaccine, but in the absence of a vaccine, you still have to undertake your program activities. And so it becomes on almost a case-by-case basis that you're going to be sending people overseas. But what's happening is that the local resources are now becoming so much more important. So we're really seeing the national organizations, the local NGOs and CSOs becoming much more relevant. Not that they weren't prior, but they have more impact, more power, because there's nobody else there. And so the efforts are now being put into ensuring that they have the resources that they need to deliver. So all of that is kind of happening at the same time. I think there is a question, and I'm going to let Bill speak to the carbon footprint because that's his area of expertise. I think the issue that I would like to put is, as a young professional, I had my first overseas experience in Indonesia when I was about 35. Now, when I'm going through a stack of CVs for a project officer position such as Laura's, unless that person who's come right out of university from NIPSIA or one of the others, unless they have 6 months to a year of experience, I'm not even interested. They have to have some experience. So you get into this whole issue of, the what are we calling it? Tourism, development tourism, where at least then you've got something on your CV to prove that you've worked internationally for 2 weeks, building a house and wherever, I don't know. So there's all of these kind of questions as to how do you provide young professionals with that grounding that they need in working overseas, and at the same time recognizing the impact of travel and the nature of it within international development. So Bill, over to you.
I think you've covered it pretty well, Jean. I guess the only thing I would add is that the pandemic has given all of us a chance to pause and look at what was good about the old normal, and moving forward as we get past the pandemic, what should the new normal look like? And we see that Zoom and other online technologies are quite effective and work well. And so in many cases, there will be opportunities to reduce travel, and that reduces expenses, okay? And then that's more money that can go to the ultimate stakeholders. And it also can only have a positive impact on carbon. So I think it's good. I agree completely. Getting in the field, there's nothing like it to have first-hand experience, the cross-cultural experience, really get a feeling for the milieu. But it is good. Even in our own programming in Indonesia, we switched to a completely different mode now. There's some downside to it, but some of the positive things are our reach is huge now. Our operating costs are much lower, and we're actually much more inclusive than we used to be, because before we couldn't afford to bring 500, 600 people into Jakarta. And of course, it would have had a horrible carbon impact. So there's pros and cons to it, and I think it'll be interesting to see as we move out of the pandemic where it all works out.
If I may just add, I mean, one challenge though, of course, and I'm mindful of this, because when you look at the stats, it's really quite striking, is that, hospitality, accommodation, and tourism as a sector is disproportionately, employs women. And so this is a sector that, it is a challenge, because we are seeing a gendered element to the unemployment data, not just in this country, but globally. And so, as many of my colleagues who are obviously very passionate about the environment, attest to how wonderful it is that, we don't have people traveling. It really comes at the backs of a lot of vulnerable people. The tourism industry, employs many people. And I think about a region that I study a lot, the Middle East. This is catastrophic for them that they don't have tourists coming. So, I mean, this is the flip side of things. We have to constantly look at it from a multitude of dimensions. And so, while yes, our carbon footprint is lower, and that's to be celebrated, there are people who are going to be hurting And so we have to come up with ideas and solutions to help them too. And some of that is domestic. I mean, it's not just overseas. Hospitality, tourism, and accommodation is a sector that, again, even in Canada, is disproportionately women employed.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to thank all of our panel members for the insights so far. I think we're going to address some of the questions that have been already been posted, and we would welcome any others you might have. Just a reminder, please be sure to type your question into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. And panelists, feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts on any of the incoming questions. First one, we need sustainable development initiatives that can contribute to impact at a large scale. If no one is to be left behind, how can international development contribute to impact at scale? Are there lessons or suggestions? Over to the panel.
Rohinton, do you want to try this one?
Yeah, no, actually, I was trying to find the chat function, and I'm sorry I'm so klutzy in these things, but thanks for reading the question. Look, going to scale has always been the issue in development, and I think one side of me says transferability and applicability is important, but as we know, there are so many subtleties across cultures and geographies and economies that we shouldn't make a fetish of this either. And if something works somewhere, let's celebrate that too. This said, I would make a plug for my former organization, of which I think Canada should be proud, IDRC, as doing things at a certain level, and then it goes global, and we don't even remember that initial connection and take credit for. The International Agricultural Research System began as a sort of Canadian and a couple of US foundations project, is now the CGIAR, has been for many decades, and has kind of more or less put hunger and malnutrition, as we used to know it in the 60s, behind us. We don't even think about those initial investments in the mid-60s and 70s, starting with the Green Revolution. But that's the time and scale it takes. And at this point, attribution becomes an issue. So I think we have to recognize, and I'd make the same point with work that Canada did in Tanzania and elsewhere on micronutrients and on so-called essential health interventions, which have led to changes in the way we do policy in the health sector. So I think there are success stories that we should learn from. There are probably failures as well, and I don't know what you all think, but I think, you know, some of the focus on millennium villages and some of the things we've seen around very micro-targeted charity is not replicable, nor should it be, nor should we be celebrating that kind of thing. We've had an episode in Canada recently where we've confused tourism with development and charity with development. So I think there's good and bad that we have to understand. But if we get to, if we inculcate the concept of evidence-based policymaking, it doesn't matter what the specific intervention is. I think it's the ethos that's more important.
And universities can help, right? I mean, this is a great opportunity for universities and think tanks, of course. I'm happy to have my foot in both doors. This is where we can help, right? Because we do very much value the peer-reviewed research process and can very much provide that kind of evidence-based knowledge. So absolutely.
Laura, then one thing I'd like to add too. I think universities, NGOs, CSOs, projects, donor-funded programs, they're the right place for IDRC, the right place for experimentation, research, and coming up with these great concepts that can then be replicated and scaled up. But I think a part that's often difficult and is really critical is then working with government so that from early on, so that they feel that they've got some ownership for it, and so that they can replicate. Because in many, many countries, assuming you've got a government that's responsible, there are cases where it's impossible to work with the government. But in most cases, there's some kind of functioning government that can help ramp things up. And their resources in almost all cases, are many fold more than any donor or any project can offer. And if you really want to have broad scale replicability, at some point it needs to be ramped up and taken on by the government. So I think, because I have worked in the past with some NGOs that really didn't want to have anything to do with government. Okay, and you might feel great to do fantastic things in one little village or with 500 or 5,000 people, but in many cases there are millions or tens of millions of people that are waiting for solutions.
The next question from the audience. How do you see the current and future role of evaluations during the pandemic? What has changed, and do you see new trends, challenges, and opportunities for monitoring and evaluation in the current context?
I guess I can start and maybe can get others to add in on this one. So Emma, the monitoring and evaluation processes now are basically limited to what you can do by Zoom or by mechanisms that are allowing you to reach out through technology. So in one sense, you're actually able to broaden your scope of what you're able to do from an evaluation perspective, because you can talk to a whole lot more people when you don't have to ship them across roads to get to a community center where you have the meeting. So that's one thing. But in that part of that process, there still is that requirement for somebody in the local community to go make sure that everybody has the technology that they need, that they're aware that they need to be. So in some ways, what you're doing is you're transferring the risk, the ethical risk from the monitoring and evaluation person here to somebody in the field who's now out being exposed potentially to COVID or something else. So there is that kind of thing. So one of the changes is in that technology thing, which has both pluses and minuses. I think,
Jean, I'm going to intervene if it's okay. I believe there's some audio challenges coming through.
That's right.
So see, this is further evidence that bandwidth is not perfect, even in urban areas like Waterloo. So sorry, Jean, I think we should probably throw it back to Laura to perhaps maybe to our colleagues.
Okay, so
Laura, I could add something just very quickly.
yeah, please, Bill.
I think what our experience has been, and poor Jean's on such a lag there. I think our experience has been that it's not too hard to get a lot of the quantitative data, because you can get that from people online. What's missing is the qualitative aspect, and I think always in monitoring and evaluation, you always need the qualitative to help you interpret the quantitative data, to give it some context, and that's the part that's difficult to do. And frankly, I don't know what the solution for that is. It's just a piece that's a little bit weak right now, but maybe we'll come up with strategies, effective ways and affordable ways to do that.
I'm just looking at the time here. We have a minute to go, so I think I'm going to wrap things up. And perhaps I could send the rest of the questions to the panelists, and we could post some answers online. So thank you so much, everyone, for the engaging dialogue, and I hope that we can continue these conversations outside of this webinar. And as we continue to move through the pandemic and the challenges that come ahead. And I appreciate you all being here. And thanks again, audience, for joining us. And just a quick note to everyone to continue to stay safe and keep well. Okay, goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Wonderful day.
Thank you, you too.